Good afternoon, viewers. Today we're going to be discussing oil and gas, and in particular, oil and gas from Alberta and exports to the U.S., the pipeline, various other associated issues. In case you haven't kept up, apparently Albertans are chomping on the bit to separate from Canada. Apparently, they believe that they have the right to do so and that their oil and gas will support them in a new country. So it's interesting to see where this is going. Um, Corey, what's your view on that?
Well, out here in Alberta, oil is always a hot topic. The subject that we're hearing now are a lot of Smith wanting to get oil to out of the province because we have record production right now. There's a lot of information about oil and gas that people do not understand. Politicians do not know much about the oil and gas industry out here in Alberta or in Canada for that matter. And you see it evident in all their grandstanding on the issues, and then they inevitably cost Canadians and Albertans money from that grandstanding so that they can cater to the influence of the businesses from usually the US or outside of Canada that are running and controlling and owning the oil and the oil production and distribution of oil in Canada now. Creates a few problems. And one of the problems that I see as a very important one was the fact that we have to get our oil out of the province. In the 1950s, we had a problem. We couldn't get our oil and gas to market. And under the guidance of the government of the time, they decided that they would implement a new strategy on dealing with oil and gas industry. The socialist government or social credit government, I guess we should say. They were more interested in making sure that Albertans had a strong living standard. And what they decided from all their research was that Alberta needed to own its own distribution of the product that we had in Alberta. So they set up a crown corporation called the Alberta Gas Trunkline Corporation. And its sole purpose was to build pipelines to get our product out of Alberta. And they built pipelines to the west coast. They tried to build pipelines going east. They built pipelines going south. The point that I wanted to make was that these pipelines generated massive income to the province of Alberta. And this income came from shipping costs. So they could charge a reasonable rate to ship oil and gas out of the province. Now, since the Crown Corporation was owned by the Alberta government, they made sure that they had excessive capacity to ship out of the province. This excess capacity meant that they didn't have to charge a premium rate for shipping their oil and gas to their clients. Lo and behold, it was so profitable. I estimate that it was the second largest income next to the royalty on oil for the province of Alberta. When Peter Lougheed implemented the Heritage Trust Fund, he failed to make a big press release on the selling of the Crown Corporation. In 1979, it was planned to sell the pipeline company that was owned by Alberta to private entities. What this meant to Albertans was that we lost revenue to our coffers. And since then, we haven't put as much money into the Heritage Trust Fund because that lost revenue meant we had to cover the expenses and revenues out of taxes or other areas. And that cost taxpayers right out of their pocketbook. One of the dumbest moves ever in Canadian history. And it will go down in the books as the dumbest Canadian historical move was selling the Crown-owned pipeline to private interests. Since that time, we've been short pipelines and moving our product out of Alberta. And it's been a big controversy for many governments. One of the issues was that we are paying a premium now to pipeline companies to ship the product out of Alberta because private business is in it to make profit. And that profit comes at the expense of Albertans because it does lower the price that companies are going to pay for our oil. There is no oversupply issue in the pipeline. It is who can buy the right to ship your oil and product to the marketplace. And this means that right now, my estimates, it's hard to get an exact price, but a barrel of oil is charged anywhere from $10 a barrel up to $18 a barrel to ship it out of the province of Alberta. In a pipeline, it's $10 minimum, and by rail car, it's about $18 a barrel to ship it out. What this means is the buyers are saying, well, we're not going to pay that high of a shipping cost, so we're going to offer you lower prices for your oil and gas to be shipped to us. And where that affects us is our royalties are based off of the price we're getting for the oil, or the price the oil companies are getting for the oil from their head office, and they set the prices. They also set the prices going down the pipeline. That eats into the profitability of the resources. Now, I can go into further details on this, but what's your take on the pipeline situation in Alberta?
Well, it's obvious if you only have one customer, then your single customer dictates what they're prepared to pay for your product. In this case, the Alberta oil is selling for 2/3 of the world price because of the one customer. Now, we have two customers now, thanks to the second pipeline. India and China apparently have bought 200,000 barrels per day, which is a significant amount of oil that isn't going to the U.S. And
well, that pipeline handles 890,000 barrels of oil a day. So one of the problems is there's a lack of desire for U.S.-owned companies to actually put oil in that pipeline going to the coast. And therein lies another problem as to who regulates where the oil is going, because it's private sector telling where their oil is going to go. And that's costing Albertans and Canadians again. And that's another issue of mismanagement on the part of Alberta government over the last half century. And it's a consistent misrepresentation of how the industry should be handled to maximize the returns for Albertans and mitigate the environmental impacts on Canada and the world. This is something that we could spend a lot of time talking about, because both you and I have a background in oil and gas, and we know firsthand that we have to compete with American and foreign business as locals, and we are not on the same level playing field. But that's another issue in and of itself. So when we're talking about this pipeline that you mentioned going to the coast, the last one that was built was in the 50s. And this one pushed the cost, and it was cost pushing by American interest to say, hey, you know, we want lobby groups to oppose the pipeline, because if Alberta and Canada opened up access to other sources, it would mean the Americans would have to pay a lot more for their product, and they could not gouge for the transmission costs. So there was a lot of opposition. It cost $34 billion in the end for Ottawa, because they couldn't put their foot down and say, we're getting it done and these lobby groups be damned, because it's a national interest, not a business whim. It was of a national interest to do so. Now under Trump, we see why it was a national interest to do so. The other issue with this $34 billion, if the pipeline was to hold pretty good capacity, let's say 80% capacity going to the coast, that would generate about $2.5 to $3 billion in transmission revenue to that corporation. So the cost of the pipeline actually comes back over probably 20 years. Pipelines are designed to last 50 to 100 years, and if you maintain and keep them going, they'll probably last more than 100 years, because they met a lot of environmental regulations, and the wear and tear is one of the issues, but you can replace segments as you go. That means that it was still at a high rate of $34 billion, was going to be a profitable endeavor for Canada and Alberta, yet Alberta didn't invest in it. Now, Alberta has set up this oil in exchange for royalty program, which is going to cost Albertans more money over the long run, because now we're getting a product that we have to pay to dilute to ship in an overcharged ship capacity of pipelines or rail car. And that's going to mean we get less return on our money from buying this exchange for oil. Now, I don't know if you've read much about that, but Smith has decided that she's going to facilitate oil sands development and other developments by accepting oil in exchange for royalty. Now, had Alberta invested in building pipeline to the coast, they have a built-in supply. They don't have to go to a foreign-owned producer and say, can you please ship your oil through our pipelines? And they say, no, we're shipping it for more money down to our Texas refineries. It's very logical that Alberta's going to get screwed over by this oil exchange because Alberta does not own and control the shipping costs, or they produce enough whatever you call that, what do they call that, diluent? Diluting material anyway for the heavy oil. And we ship in 200,000 barrels a day of this diluent. I can't pronounce it without.
Diluent?
Yeah. But we ship in 200,000 barrels a day from the U.S. and they jack the prices up on it because they know it's got to go to dilute the bitumen to come down, running the costs up so that they can rape and pillage the resource as much as possible for profitability. My point is that we need to start understanding the oil and gas industry more as voters. As politicians, you should take a few courses in it and quit giving our resources away. They are finite. They don't last forever. And the easiest to produce resources are taken first. So from now on, we're having harder and harder to get at resources to produce, to ship to market. And eventually that's going to run the costs up astronomically, and we're always stuck with the environmental bill. I kind of got off topic, but you can see there's going to be a lot of discussions that we can have on specific topics on the oil and gas industry in Alberta and Canada that we hope to enlighten the viewers, and we'd like comments from the viewers as to what you'd like expanded in our conversations. So I'll let you get back to what you were talking about, the pipeline going to BC.
The advantage of obviously is that you now have second customer or other international customers, I guess is the best way to put it. Now, when you look at pipelines, of course, people object to pipelines because they claim that they're not environmentally friendly, that they add to the greenhouse gases by allowing people to have access to oil and gas, I guess, that they're dangerous, particularly when they leak. Recently, there was a Keystone Pipeline leak April 8th, 2025 at Fort Ranson, North Dakota, which is almost directly south of Winnipeg in North Dakota. And that spill was 3,500 barrels. Now, to put that into perspective, each rail car holds about 700 barrels, which means that it's about 4 rail cars worth of oil that has spilled out of the pipeline before the pipeline was shut down. If a train with 100 oil and gas, cars derails, you're looking at a significantly larger disaster than if you have a leak in a pipeline. So when you're looking at the safety of moving oil, obviously pipelines are the way to go. Now, everybody has their hand out all along the pipeline, from the people who live on, the pipeline corridor, and I can understand why nobody wants anything in their neighborhood, in particular, industry, if you live in the countryside. The trouble is, if you look at what's happening in Canada right now, in particular, the industrial industries in southern Ontario, and I presume it includes Quebec, have lost about 60,000 man jobs due to the tariffs and the threats of the tariffs. So Canada has to come up with some kind of measure to protect itself. Quite likely, if this continues, if Trump's emergency is not set aside, it could be the end of the automobile manufacturing in Canada, which means that there's a huge number of jobs at risk here. And the only way to get the attention of the Americans is to put a fee on something they want, and they want the oil.
Yeah, well, they need the oil. It's not a
They
matter of
can't.
want. I think in the 1970 oil crisis is where Alberta and Canada got screwed over, because that's when we said, oh, we'll back you, US, you don't have to worry about Saudis anymore. We'll supply and make sure it's steady supply to Texas. And that's when we started the downward slide of being raped and pillaged for our resources. It was a good gesture will by Canadians to try to prop up the oil supply of the Americans. And now it's backfired on us decades later, and it's not going to get any better.
Well, the war on Iraq has brought to the Americans' attention how fragile the oil production in the Middle East could be. In other words, the Iranians could easily have destroyed several refineries, blocked the straits, and interrupted the shipping, just, quite like the Houthis did, causing huge damage to the American oil and gas industry and its economy. Now, the Americans have a habit of trying to isolate people with sanctions and promote their own business interests. Venezuela has one of the biggest reserves of oil and gas in the world. It's right across from the refineries in Texas. It would be a logical place to develop exports to the US. It's shorter, quicker, it's got good quality oil. The problem is it has what the Americans consider a socialist government. In other words, the Venezuelans haven't bent over and let the Americans have their way with them. And as a result, they're suffering from sanctions. So Canada now is suffering from sanctions. Mexico is suffering from sanctions. It's time that the oil producers in the world get together again, just like they did for OPEC, and put some leverage on the consumers. Now, the US not only is one of the world's largest consumers of oil, it is one of the world's largest producers and even an export of oil.
Well, so I think they take a lot of Canadian oil and then upgrade it, and then they ship it out on the world market and make huge profits off of the discount that they're buying our oil. And they set the price of oil here in Alberta, not Alberta or Canada. And that's a problem in and of itself too. So they make the largest bumps by making the oil go to their Texas refineries so that they can be the world's number 1 or 2 exporter in the world for oil products, and it's off the backs of Canada.
The point is, now that there's a second pipeline, or a third pipeline that goes to the BC coast, you can start exporting crude directly to Asia, and Asia can become your new market. Now, the other side of this, of course, is how much production is there in Alberta? Like, can Alberta sustain? My cat knocked the light over.
Yeah, typical pussy.
Yeah.
You were talking about pipelines going to the West Coast. One of the issues is it has to be smarter planned in Canada. We've learned, or should have learned, from our lessons with giving our oil directly to the Texas states through private pipelines. We have to take a look at what Alberta had done again in the 50s. The federal government should be the ones in charge of pipelines leaving Alberta, because they're crossing boundaries within Canada and shipping exports over to international waters. They should work in conjunction with the different provinces to have vested interest by each province in the pipelines going across the provinces, because the pipelines generate easy money. There's very little maintenance and work required once a pipeline's in the ground, and it's very affordable and profitable business. So why on earth would you not lower our tax dollars and our tax burdens by collecting money and revenue off of the pipeline? And that way we can better supply our world buyers. and we can have pipelines go to Hudson Bay, we can have pipelines go to the East Great Lakes, whatever it takes. There's refineries all across Canada that could use our supply of oil much more efficiently than, say, the Americans. And by making a crown corporation, we can model more like Norway, where we become very sustainable and very wealthy off of the fact that we set the prices of the oil and we set the prices for transmission and we determine who the final buyers are. So what's going on right now is just another name of the National Energy Program, which was gaslighted by Americans, and Albertans bought into it, and Western Canada bought into this gaslighting and killed the National Energy Program, which said not only in oil and gas that our resource companies had to be 50% owned by Canadians, and that is not the case to this day. Now, this re-implementation of the National Energy Program is going to be an eye-opener for these brain-dead Albertans that bought into that National Energy Program was bad for Alberta. I can show you where we lost trillions of dollars, and that's a fact. So we start looking at the Keystone and that the oversupply to the Texas refineries. Even Biden and Obama realized that if we doubled the Keystone XL to the U.S. Texas refineries, it was only going to lead to further exploitation of our good neighbor. And we would eventually caught on that we've been ripped off for our oil by oversupply to a finite refining capacity. So I hope that Canadians have learned that it is better to invest in ourselves by making sure that we have the resources controlled by Canada and lower our taxes than to give it away and be whining and crying because we can't cover any bills anywhere. Which reminds me, I don't know if you're aware, but Alberta just announced that it had an $8.9 billion surplus after cutting social services, senior benefits, Medicare. Benefit, Medicare, everything was cut. We even have to pay now $110 for a COVID vaccine because they're anti-vaxxers in there, and they don't want this money to go to anybody but their corporate supporters. So now you'll see Smith starts promoting that she wants private pipelines built so that they can make profit off of the money, and she'll give tax benefit and tax loans and business loans to these businesses to build these pipelines. Well, that's only hurting Alberta. And there's no other way of saying it. Take that $8 billion and do some joint venture with the federal government and actually protect the assets of Alberta and not, rape and pillage assist. So that's my take. I don't know if you followed that, but please give us comments on your takes on this latest development of how we're being sold out.
Well, here's an issue. Now that Alberta has come to the rationalization that they're going to have to suffer from federal oversight in order for the feds to use oil and gas as a lever against Trump, they're now talking about separating, which is interesting because if they were to separate, obviously, they would still have the same problem that they only have one customer, especially if BC decided to cut off the pipeline going through British Columbia. And,
well, Ebby in BC said he doesn't want any Crown corporation putting a pipeline through BC. He isn't in favor of that. He only wants private pipelines to go through BC to the coastal waters. Therein, who's paying for the politicians to be elected. They are owed favors to these private sector businesses because there is no way a private sector business should be allowed to have a pipeline shipping our goods to coastal waters ever because of the environmental impact and because of the profiteering, and it lowers our cost of oil profitability to taxpayers. So that's my rant again, but we need smarter people and quit costing Albertans and Canadians money by rhetoric and gaslighting.
Well, I'm not sure what the private pipeline executive makes.
Pretty good money. I'm willing to do it anytime the government wants to for a reasonable wage. It's not $500 thousand plus bonuses, putting it around 3 million, 4 million per executive. It's ridiculous. Like, there's reasonable wages, and we've lost that in Canadian society. Executives like me would love to help out the Canadian social environment, but we're not allowed to because we're pushed aside. We're the castaway Canadians. We get cast aside by not only Canadians, but Canadians influenced by foreign businesses. So that's another rant. So what else do you want to cover here on the pipeline issue?
Well,
I
think the problem's going to be is what happens if Alberta says they're going to separate.
Well, they're going to have a problem because people like me don't want stupid running the province in a separation. We've already demonstrated 50, 60 years of the stupidest one government control ever, and they're all backed by foreign money. And I'm going to show you how that money cost you, the taxpayer, a lot. We should be Saudi Arabia of North America. We should be one of the wealthiest areas, and our standard of living and healthcare be exemplary for the rest of the world. Instead, we've been gaslit and ripped off of our resources, all because politicians want to get these great jobs after politics, and you're none aware of it. Kenny, he's working for Bennett Jones as an advisor for international affairs or something. Like, what would Kenny be doing working for the largest legal firm that is in Texas, it's Canadian owned, which ensures oil going back and forth down the pipeline? And that's Peter Lougheed's old firm. And it's not surprising that Peter Lougheed sold the pipeline corporations, because it made him a great partner to have in Bennett Jones. That's my take on it. History is written by the victors, but history needs to research who was profiteering at a time when the average person was losing their social status and health care and everything else at the expense of a few lining their pockets. And I think that's the problem with the world right now. It's the politics is all who has the money, and it protects the people with the money.
Well, I'm trying to figure out what the executive compensation is for the Keystone, executives, essentially.
It's private. They probably won't tell you, but there is bonuses, I'm sure.
They don't. And they don't say. And one of the reasons, of course, you wouldn't want a public company managing a pipeline is because the executive compensation.
Public corporations, and we know that Canada Post is probably one of the overpaid positions in Canada, and they pay their top executives $700,000 a year to run Canada Post. I mean, it's a pretty simple courier business, but there's a lot of responsibilities. Hell, I'm willing to do it for $300,000. Pretty simple. I know courier industry, it's not hard. But the average compensation for an executive would be about $238,000 a year. And that, you remember, is under a union guarantees and all sorts of other aspects of this corporation. So there, if we compare that to, say, Enbridge has an average compensation for their executives about $235,000 a year. The median being $242,728, according to this document. Now, their top president, they don't even tell you what he makes, but the CFO makes $2.66 million, and the executive vice president makes $2 million, and all down the board makes all sorts of millions. So when you're comparing, is the work of Enbridge as a CEO any harder than running a crown corporation? I say probably not, because you have a lot more competent management below you that have the ability to be delegated workload to. So the Crown Corporation dealing with unions and all sorts of stuff would make it a little more complex, but there would also be downward delegation, but you have to answer to Congress, or not Congress, but answer to Parliament and overseers. So there might be pretty comparable management issues. In that capacity, there's no way that you should be paying $8 million to the CEO of Canada Post. And the same level of skill and knowledge would be required to run that position as Enbridge. So profiteering is the name of the game when private business. In an industry that is a finite resource, profiteering is probably not the best thing to be looking at as a business model. And sticking Albertans and Canadians with the cleanup costs is not a proper model at all. And when you look into the drilling compensation, where they get royalty holidays for the cost of drilling, you're seeing that the investment actually isn't really significant for drilling. And we're stuck with the cost of cleanup. So when you remodel the business model and say, look, if we're having to pay these private corporations to come in and drill up our asset, and we have to pay for the cleanup, where's the profit going? Oh, to their pockets, leaving the local economy and leaving to the US or overseas. That's not very smart on a business end. And we got a model called Norway that shows that Crown should be owning and doing these things when private sector is failing. I would love to do joint venture drilling with the government. If they help me drill, I'm willing to pay and share the profits and proceeds with Canadians and taxpayers. You won't see that from American companies. You won't see that from European companies, but locally, it's to my advantage to contribute to my community. And I'd love to be able to financially afford to drill and get back into business after being raped and pillaged by the Saskatchewan government in a land banking scam that pushes my company out of business. Now that's common sense. I mean, we cannot go raise money easily to compete with the Americans because the privately owned Securities Commission has been given laws saying you can't go raise money to compete with us. Now, if the government joint ventures with me, I'm more than willing to share the profits with them and keep a reasonable wage for doing the job. It's to my benefit and to my community benefit, but they'll never do it because it doesn't line the politician's pocket.
Subscribe to the channel, give us a like, and please share the video. Don't be afraid to share this commercial with your friends too.